nostalgia is about like what makes life beautiful, right? Like this, our nostalgic memories are part of what makes life beautiful. And so we have a bunch of, as I noted, we have a bunch of mundane memories that are, it's not like these are useless memories. Like it's good to know. It's good, for instance, that I know how to drive to the grocery store and like what aisle things are on. It's like, you don't want, it's good to habituate, right? And to be able to know, to have that kind of level of memory. But that's not what really enriches life and adds that layer of color to life. And I think so, I think nostalgia memories are beautiful memories. I think that's a good way to say it.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. Hey everybody, welcome to the first episode of Season 3. Our focus for this season is going to be yearning. And we're going to look at some of the various ways in which we're driven by our longing for beauty. I thought the best place to start might be to look at our yearning for beautiful memories, which is one way to define the concept of nostalgia. My guest for this episode is one of the world's leading experts on nostalgia, Dr. Clay Routledge. Clay is the Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Archbridge Institute. He's also co-editor-in-chief of Profectus, a magazine on human progress and flourishing. And prior to joining Archbridge Institute, Clay spent nearly 2 decades in academia as a professor of psychology, professor of management, and distinguished professor of business. As a leading expert in existential psychology and human motivation, Clay's work focuses on helping people reach their full potential and building meaningful lives. He's a highly cited researcher who has published more than 100 scholarly papers, authored several books, and published several articles in popular outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and more. And he's received numerous awards for his research and mentorship. His latest book is Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. In our conversation, we talk about the relationship between beauty and nostalgia and some surprising findings from his research, including how nostalgia leads us to connect more deeply with others and how it can be a driver of innovation. Let's get started. All right, Clay, thanks for joining us on the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, great. Well, listen, to get started, I had sent you a question to think about, which I think ties in very well to your work on nostalgia. Can you think of an experience of profound beauty that comes to your mind from your childhood and something that lingers with you till today, something you might perhaps go back to from time to time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And because it got me thinking about how I live, like kind of my lifestyle now, which is I live out in the woods and, I'm very, very, I wouldn't consider myself like a hardcore outdoors person. I don't do like a ton of camping and things like that, for instance, but like I really, really value just daily walks on trails and in nature. And, that's just big. That's a big part of like lifestyle experience that's meaningful to me. Like compared to, I love cities, I love urban environments too, but like my preference is kind of to be out in nature as much as I can. And then I had to, and so that provoked me thinking about, I didn't really like grow up doing that kind of stuff. I grew up in, a fairly like small city, but kind of more urban environment. And then I remembered my parents took us on this trip to Colorado when we were kids. And that doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Like you took this road trip to Colorado. So what? Well, my family didn't have a lot of money. We didn't go on a lot of vacations. Most of the vacations we did were very local or very regional. They were just what we could get to in a couple hours. And so it was kind of a big deal to pack up in the car and go on this, I don't know, it's probably like a 10 or 11 hour drive to Colorado from Missouri where we lived. And I just remember going to like Pikes Peak, Garden of the Gods, these places, and just being like, I'd never seen anything like this. The topography was so different than, where I lived in kind of a flat area. And I think that kind of stuck with me. It's like, that you can have these beautiful spaces, these beautiful outdoor spaces. And then when I was really thinking about that memory more, and I think this is a little bit of a hint as to, maybe what we'll talk about with nostalgia, what I realized was at the time I didn't really care that much. Like I was a kid, like, and I was like, oh, this is fun, but it wasn't. My parents were making a big production about it, but I didn't care that much. But looking back on it now, I've layered in all my experience growing up, being an adult, having children myself, getting to choose like my own like lifestyle preferences. And then I really started to think, oh, what the way, oftentimes the way nostalgia works is it's not that moment in time itself was super impactful in the moment. It's the making sense of it, realizing that was a big deal for my parents, that actually was a big financial sacrifice. Like we didn't have a lot of money. And so that social component, that like how that connects me to people, all of that it comes from my retrospection and me like making sense of it and sort of injecting it with meaning. And so, yeah, that's the memory that I think is probably, influenced a lot of my current preferences, even though I hadn't really put a lot of thought of until you gave me that reason to think about it. So thank you.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Well, it's a really fascinating connection you make to that experience with your family, because often when people talk about connection to nature, it seems like an intrinsic relationship, right? With just the beauty of nature and feeling maybe a sense of awe, or just a sense of unity with the natural world. And I think of, people who maybe took that a little too far, the transcendentalists, people like Thoreau and Emerson, and you have this sense of wanting to maybe reject urban life and really sort of value this connection to nature. And there's a kind of nostalgia there, right? To like wanting a simpler way of life that maybe reflects something true about the human condition, truer than what we find in our artificially created environments, perhaps.
So last year at the Human Flourishing Lab, we conducted this survey looking at what Americans think about the past. And we surveyed, what was interesting about this is we were asking people of all different generations. So the young adults, Gen Z, all the way up to older Americans. And we asked, and we were specifically interested in the relationship with technology. And we asked them to what extent they would like to go back to a time before everyone was like so plugged in, to social media, for instance. And if you ask people in advance, like to make a prediction, most of us would probably say, well, the older people are going to be cranky and be like, oh, we need to go back and get rid of this stuff. And younger people are going to be more enthusiastic about modernity. And actually what we found is Gen Z was very highly nostalgic for that simpler time before everyone was plugged in. So even though it was their digital natives and it was before their own lives, that they remember, there was a sense of nostalgia for a time, but before like we were so plugged in. So I think you're absolutely right. There's something about this yearning for a simpler life where maybe people were doing more face-to-face, more hands-on, more analog things. And so I think that seems to transcend the generations. It's not just something that older people feel. It turns out that a lot of younger people feel that way. And in fact, if you look at some consumer trends, it's Gen Z that's driving a lot of the consumption of analog products, including like collecting vinyl records and CDs and buying other sorts of things that maybe seem a little bit outdated now.
Yeah, well, I want to double click on this a little bit and get a better sense of what you think is going on. Well, let's start with maybe tell us a little bit about your own journey into the field of psychology and what drew you to that, and then existential psychology in particular, and then the study of nostalgia.
When I was in college, I didn't even know, I'd never even heard of existential psychology, but I became very interested in the idea of mental time travel. Even as an undergrad, I was fascinated with this idea that time is something that you can measure objectively. In fact, we have extremely precise clocks now, right? But it's also a subjective experience. And we've all had this experience where time flies or time drags on. We've all had the experience of like, we look back on our lives and we're like, oh, where did the time go? And so I became fascinated with that idea, like the subjective experience of time. And really what I was interested in is, that more kind of practical level of what are the sort of data inputs into our brain, maybe that give us our sense of time. So it's very like different than, anything existential. But then I went to grad school and, I kind of started doing something else. But then I came back around to this idea of time when I discovered existential psychology, particularly the writings of the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. And what Becker proposed is one of the advanced cognitive capacities that distinguishes our species is our ability to introspect, right? Our high levels of self-awareness. It's not that other organisms aren't self-aware, but we're extremely self-aware, right? Well, on top of that, we have this ability to move the self through time. So we can think about our futures and we can think about our past. This is important for the advancement of civilization. This is key to human progress. Like, you're a college professor. I'm sure you've had experiences where there's students in your classes that, like, I'm sure your lectures are enthralling and students just love to be there intrinsically. But as you know, a lot of them are there because they're able to think about the future. And they're like, I don't want to go to class at 9 a.m., but in 4 years, I would like to have a college degree. So that's just so critical to personal growth, but also human progress, the ability to think about and plan for the future. But what Becker pointed out is that benefit, that blessing, so to speak, comes at a cost, which is our awareness of our inevitable demise, right? We're existentially aware that one day we're going to die. That's really what I was interested in when I got into grad school and started thinking about time, is our relationship with our own destiny of physical mortality and what that does to a person. And so I'm a psychologist, and so I was really interested in like the psychological effects, like anxiety. So, and it's true, some people have extreme existential anxiety because of these concerns. Most of us don't, though. Most of us get up every day, we move forward, we even take risks and do all sorts of bold things, despite the fact that we know that we could be killed at any moment for any reason, for reasons we can't predict or control. And so how do we navigate that space? Well, according to Becker and then a bunch of other researchers, following that, like, we invest in systems of meaning, right? Like, it helps us to feel like, well, yeah, I'm just a speck of, I'm just a speck of dust in the cosmos, but I can be part of something bigger. I can have a meaningful impact on the world. So my initial exploration into existential psychology started very much focused on time, but on what are the implications of being an organism capable of imagining the future. And then that kind of led to, oh, well, if we can imagine, if we think about the future, we also think about the past. And maybe those two things are connected. Maybe the fears and uncertainties and anxieties we have about the future provoke us to look to the past for comfort and perhaps even guidance.
Yeah. No, that's great. And so, yes, that makes sense. Then you would look at nostalgia, I suppose, as looking to the past, perhaps to pacify our anxieties in the present. And I was really surprised to see one of your findings on how it's not simply a matter of a kind of coping mechanism for the present, but even a planning resource for the future, right? And before we go there, though, could you talk a little bit about how you as a psychologist conceptualize nostalgia, right? Because a lot of people think of nostalgia as just sort of kind of a wistful longing, right? Like a yearning for times past, often pleasant experiences from the past. How is that different from what you're looking at, or how is it similar to what you're looking at?
Yeah, so the concept of nostalgia, you can actually think about in a lot of different ways. Most of my work as a psychologist is focused on what we'd call autobiographical nostalgia or personal nostalgia. So these are your personal memories and your relationship with them, and we can get into the yearning and the affective component of that. But just real quick, like, you can also think about nostalgia beyond the individual self. So there's a concept that we call collective nostalgia, which is, I have my own personal memories, but I'm also a social and cultural organism that, that's part of a larger, world. And to that extent, there are things that happen that we share collectively that we might have like a yearning for. Even, and this is what I think it gets really cool, that can even lead into what's referred to as historical nostalgia, which you can feel nostalgic for a time before you were born. And you see this a lot, of course, with aesthetic preferences. Like, people like certain fashions or architecture, music, even for times before they were around. So there's all sorts of different ways to take nostalgia outside of this, beyond the self, and connect it to the broader world in our history. But really, what most of my research has focused on is the personal nostalgia. And the way we conceptualize that is you can think of nostalgia as really like a cocktail of cognition, emotion, and then I would add motivation. And so cognition, nostalgia involves our memories. These are our autobiographical memories. And so when we feel nostalgic, we often bring to mind certain types of experiences, and we've cataloged these. Now we've done, we've actually probably had tens of thousands, if not more, like narrative collections from people all over the world, just asking them to share with us their nostalgic memories. And so we have kind of a sense of like what the prototypical types of memories are, like what types of memories people tend to be nostalgic about. Of course, there's great variability as a function of culture, age, gender, all those things. But there is a common sort of understanding of nostalgia, which I can get into that. So that's the cognitive. But then there's like the emotional part, which is like the nostalgia is a bittersweet emotional experience. So it is happy memory. Like we do tend to think about things that were good times, but just like humans like stories of drama, like if you go to a movie, for instance, if the movie was just 2 hours of pure, like going from strength to strength, right? Like pure 2 hours of joy and just people winning. It's actually not a very good movie. A good movie is one where there's triumph over tragedy, where maybe things are going well, but they have a major barrier or setback. They get knocked down. And then you get to see their character. You get to see their resilience. You get to see them grow, learn from mistakes. So our nostalgic memories are often like that. They can even be things that at the time were really stressful, but later we look back on and we're like, oh, well, yeah, even though at that Thanksgiving dinner we were fighting and my mom was really stressed out because something got burned or whatever, like, we also laughed, and that was a really meaningful time together. And actually, it turns out that was the last time, I got to see Grandpa or something like that. So there's this cocktail of sadness, loss, but also with appreciation, gratitude, joy. So there's that emotional complexity, and then I would add like a motivational component, like gets to that yearning point that you're talking about. It's like, we don't just bring to mind the cognitions, the memories, and reflect on them neutrally. They're emotional. But in addition to that, we don't just passively do it. Like oftentimes we're provoked to be nostalgic because we're unsatisfied with something, or where we feel lonely, distressed, uncertain about what path to take in life. And so what we're doing is we're yearning for guidance, really, is what I think. Like we're yearning for inspiration. We're trying to reconnect with what we cherish. And so when we're trying to make decisions about how to go forward in our lives, should I take this job? Should I move to this city? What? I have all these competing possibilities. What should I privilege? Nostalgic memories can remind us that, these were the things that actually matter to us. Right. These are the cherished memories, and it's worth bringing that to mind when we're trying to figure out how to go forward. That was not like something I always thought about. Like when we first started doing nostalgia research, we very much conceptualized it as a psychological defense mechanism that largely functioned to like regulate our emotions. So when we feel sad or lonely, nostalgia comforts us, and then we can move forward, and that's great. So we thought nostalgia was healthy, but we thought of it as like a coping, like you would think of as a coping resource. But then what collecting all these narratives, running experiments, what we started to notice is when people shared nostalgic memories, they didn't just say, this, looking back on this memory, like, makes me feel good. They said things like, it makes me optimistic about the future. It reminds me what I'm fighting for. Like it gives me hope. So we started to see these more motivated affective components in people's narratives, and we're like, we should study that. Of course, you're only going to discover in an experimental research, you're only going to discover what you measure. We hadn't been measuring motivational tendencies. We had just been measuring well-being. And so then we said, okay, well, maybe if you induce nostalgia in the lab, for instance, maybe it doesn't just increase positive mood. Maybe it doesn't just increase like a sense of meaning in life. maybe it makes people more motivated to pursue their goals. Maybe it makes them actually want to go out in the world and do things. And so we started to discover, for instance, that nostalgia makes people feel more connected because it reminds them that, oh yeah, even though I'm going through a difficult time now, there's people that love me and I have all these memories with these people. That's true. But it also turns out it makes people want to connect. We engineered these studies where we gave people the opportunity, like after doing the nostalgia manipulation and then doing some other tasks, we gave them the opportunity, or we led them to believe that they had the opportunity to participate in other studies, and we gave them choices. There weren't even other studies, but what we said is like, oh, here's a study where you'll have to go in. It's a social study. You'll have to interact with people. Here's a study where you'll do things by yourself. And what we found is inducing nostalgia made people more likely to choose to participate in the study where they got to interact with other people. So that's just one example, but nostalgia pushes people towards others. So it very much has like a motivational component that really is counter to the stereotype of being nostalgic is just sitting by yourself and like ruminating or reflecting on the past. And it's a more energizing like experience that makes you want to, think about like even if you watch a nostalgic movie or something, that might trigger like, oh, I should call up this person and talk. We watched that together back in the day. Or you see this kind of thing a lot in nostalgic entertainment. Like it creates a moment, like a social media kind of moment or something where people want to share that experience. So that's what I'd say. In addition to the cognition and emotion, there is this like energetic or motivational component.
Yeah, yeah. Could you say a bit more about the relationship between nostalgia and yearning? And you mentioned the affective component as well. So is nostalgia a type of yearning, or is it, is there kind of a partial overlap with that concept of yearning or longing? What's that relationship like?
Yeah, I would say yearning or longing is a component of nostalgia. Like nostalgia is a complex experience, and yearning is part of it. It's not the whole story. Like you can yearn for things and not necessarily feel nostalgic for them. But I think a big part of what's going on in nostalgia is there is that yearning, there is that longing component. But one thing that I think that often people get wrong about that is like people who are very, very critical of nostalgia. And understandably, there are some reasons to be critical of certain forms of nostalgia. But I think people overestimate the idea that when people are yearning for the past, they want to return to the past. And those are not the same. Those are not the same thing. Like people might want to revisit the past or pull wisdom or knowledge or experience from the past, even if they have no desire to actually go back to the way things were. Most people don't, despite what they say, if you actually dig a little bit deeper, most people don't really want to go back and you don't want to live like they did 50 years ago, even though like you can do these surveys that show like, Americans think life was better in the past. They don't want to give up modern medicine or technology, or they don't want to give up the certain advances. What that yearning is saying is there is something they feel like is missing. I mean, as you know, like one of the challenges with being humans is like we're never satisfied with anything, and that's good in a sense because it means we keep tinkering and we keep trying to make the world better. Like we like progress. We want things to look, even silly things like we watch TV and be like, oh, imagine if the picture was a little bit better, the TV was a little bit larger. Like we're always kind of wondering what could be. But that's related to the yearning too, right? And that past-oriented yearning. It's like we look back and like, well, maybe it was nice when kids could just ride their bike around the neighborhood and they weren't all like on cell phones, and like, there was a little bit more freedom. And I had that in my childhood, and I kind of wish kids could have that now. Or I remember my grandmother telling me stories when I was growing up about how she rode a horse to school. And I was like, well, I don't know that I want to ride a horse to school, but like, but just, we like these kinds of stories that like connect us to, or give us the opportunity to yearn for something, and then make what I think is neat about nostalgia is the creative components. Like people don't want to ride a horse to school, but what they might want is like, more trails in their neighborhoods that there's not cars on. What I mean? Well, they might want some modern version of like, oh, it's nice not to have to deal with these certain modern inconveniences. Like, so we want those things, but we want to figure out a way to to pull in, to borrow from the past as well.
Yeah. And what's the mechanism then that you see that drives this ability of nostalgia to connect us to each other, right? Why is it not just sort of enclosing us within ourselves?
Yeah, we have this phrase we say in the nostalgic mind, the mind is peopled. And for
Mm.
some reason, like when nostalgia is really about meaningful memories. And if you ask people what gives their life meaning, they almost always say other people, or the
Mm-hmm.
connection to others, family, close friends, um, the transcendent. Their even like spiritual meaning is very much about a relationship with the divine. And so
Yeah.
meaning is about like others and about connecting to others. Nostalgia kind of reminds us of that. There's all sorts of distractions in life. We have all sorts of competing motives. And what nostalgia does, it's like, oh yeah, but these were the special times. These are the things that are really meaningful. And those, what's the common theme of those? And this gets to that cognitive component of nostalgia. When we looked across all these different memories from people all over the world, most nostalgic memories involve other people, and particularly
Mm.
loved ones. People can have nostalgic memories for solitary experiences, but they're fairly rare, actually. I mean, people
Mm.
can say,
Mm.
oh, I climbed that mountain myself, and that really revealed something about me, and I was training for this for a long time.
Mm.
That
Yeah.
can happen, but it's fairly rare. Most of the time, even in nostalgic memories of personal accomplishments, people bring their attention towards others. These are the people that helped me accomplish. Like, this was my support system. These are the people that helped me
Yeah.
accomplish this triumph. And so, I think a big part of why it pushes us towards others is because it reminds us that others are like where meaning is, and then it's like, oh, okay, so I should go out and do things. And in fact, so from like a research point of view, we've done studies and showing that when people reflect on a nostalgic memory, it makes them they bring to mind experiences of social success, which boosts their confidence, their social efficacy.
Mm.
They feel like, oh, okay, like I'm going through a tough time right now. I'm lonely right now. I moved to a new city. I started university on the other side of the country. I don't know anyone, but I've had all these social successes in the past, which means I can do it. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I can do
Yeah.
it. And that
Yeah.
kind of energizes people to have the confidence to be like, okay, well, I can go meet new people. I can start relationships. And so I think that it provides us with that kind of confidence.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to get some of my kids to make new friends, and they're resisting it. I'm like, this will help you in the future. You'll
Right?
see.
You're planting the
um,
seed.
yeah, well, trying to. I don't know if I'll succeed, but so say a little bit about the just on this conceptual point. I mean, are all memories nostalgic? Are there certain memories that are not nostalgic? And is there any kind of time scope? Right? Can I be nostalgic for something from this morning, or is it time bounded in some way?
Yeah, great questions. So, not all memories are nostalgic. We have different types of memories, and so, for instance, when we've done these experiments, oftentimes as control conditions, we'll have people bring to mind, or we say, think about a memory that makes you feel nostalgic, right? Or in another condition, think about a memory that you would describe as ordinary or mundane. And then even in another condition, we'll say, think about a memory like a pleasant or happy memory from the past. Even happy memories aren't the same as nostalgic. Like when you look at the
Hmm.
effects of these, like using the like having them think about something that's cherished or like like a nostalgic memory, like has more powerful effects than just having them think about a happy memory. So there's something about nostalgic memories that seem to be distinct from other type of autobiographical memories.
Hmm.
As far as like the time question, it's really interesting because there are no rules. Like you can be nostalgic about anything, but it's true that you tend to be more nostalgic by things that are the further separated you are, both in temporal and physical distance.
Hmm.
And so you're more likely to be nostalgic if you move for a place if you don't see it every. And I think if you're not there a lot, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
this has
Yeah.
to do with that specialness. Like if it's routine, if it's part, you don't even routine things that you like. You don't need to feel nostalgic about the gym if you go there every day. You're like, I'm going to go
Right.
there. I'm going there, right? The most powerful nostalgic memories tend to be the ones that are distal, like, and
Hmm.
that's time too. Like the further time that separates it, the more the more you feel like, oh, there's something special about accessing that. And I think another part of the time, I don't know for sure, but know this for sure because this is hard to test. But I think another element of the time component is you've had more time to sit with it, to make sense
Mm.
of it, to, reflect on it multiple times, and to, so to draw different lessons from it. And that's one of the things that I found interesting is like, you can have a nostalgic memory from, 30 years ago, something that happened 30 years ago. And maybe like 5 years after it happened, you do feel nostalgic for it. Like it was a really important thing.
Mm.
Then 10 years after, you're in a different point in your life and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that. Now that, like I gave the example of like Thanksgiving. Now that I have
Mm.
kids, I realize, oh, this means something different. And so as
Yeah.
we age, when we go through different life experiences, the same memory can take on new meaning. And,
Mm.
you might have this experience with like a really good book or a great, film, where it's like you liked it, and then you go back and watch it later and you're like, oh, I didn't even pick up on that
Yeah. Yeah.
because I didn't
Yeah.
know, I wasn't at a place in my life to really appreciate that theme.
Yeah.
Our own stories are like that, I think. And so
Right.
you can kind of have this ongoing relationship with nostalgia. In addition to that, one of the things that I've thought about more recently is how nostalgia for people that we've lost, for people that are gone, similarly allows us to keep that relationship going in new ways. Like my dad died several years ago, and now I look back on different memories, even even memories as a kid where I was probably an annoying kid who didn't appreciate the lessons my dad was teaching, trying to teach me. And I can look back now and say, oh, okay, I get it. And so I have this ongoing like dialogue with my dad, even though he's deceased. It's because he left me like all those memories, and
Yeah.
so I think
Yeah.
that's a neat feature too. It's like we can kind of, even when
Mm.
something's gone, even when a place is gone, a person is gone, it's, like some part of our life is gone, we have it. Like we can kind of, and that, that's one reason why we're terrified of cognitive decline, right? Like
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
very, very existentially like threatening idea that we might lose our memories, our sense of self, because, we want we long to keep those stories, those memories as part of us, because not just because it's nice to look back on them, but we use them. Like it's an ongoing dialogue with our past.
You're listening to Beauty at Work. This podcast is made possible through support from the John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. There are a couple of stories in your book that really struck me, that I suppose surprised me, that nostalgia is not just related to memories that we cherish. And so the example of, I think there was one with you maybe mowing the lawn when you were a kid, and it wasn't pleasant at the time, but it has nostalgic connotations. And the other one, maybe more drastic, is of this group of folks you interviewed in Southampton, I think,
Mm-hmm.
who lived through the Second World War, which sounds like it would have been a horrible experience.
Yeah.
Why does nostalgia feature in both these kinds of negative experiences?
Those are good examples of like how meaning is different than positive affect, or just positive
Mm.
emotions. One of the things that I really enjoyed about, so I spent a couple of years at the University of Southampton after finishing graduate school, because there was a research team there. This is in UK, just south of London. So there's a research team there that was also starting to do some work on nostalgia, which is what I was doing in grad school. We learned about each other, and they said, hey, when you finish your PhD, come over for a little while and like we'll collaborate. And one of the things that was neat there is Southampton is a city on the southern coast of England that 90% of was destroyed during World War II bombings. And at the time when I was over there, which was the early 2000s, there were older British adults that remember those experiences from their childhood. We were going around door to door to collect, to get community data, knocking on doors and asking people, to fill out like these nostalgia questionnaires for us. And one of the things we were doing is having them share a nostalgic memory with us, and we'd have them write it or we'd record it. What's neat about doing research with older people is they tend to be good research participants. They're happy to share share their experiences with you. And so they often give very, very rich data. And what surprised us, or I guess I should say what surprised me, was the number of people who shared a memory that we didn't ask them to think about any particular. We just said, you tell us like give us a memory that makes you this. We give them a definition of nostalgia. Nostalgia is defined as a sentimental or wistful longing for the past. Please spend a few minutes writing down a memory that makes you feel nostalgic. And what surprised me is the number of people that talked about the time during the war, during World War II. And there was a lot of tragedy in these narratives. They weren't sugarcoating it. They weren't saying this was an awesome time or this was a fun time. They were saying it was a very difficult time. It was a tragic time. Families were separated. Fathers were sent over to continent to fight war. Kids were separated from their mothers or sent with their grandparents out to the country. So there was all this, but the reason they shared these stories is in those stories was an appreciation for how events like that remind you of like what's important in life, like family, togetherness, like being part of something, and all the sort of things we get distracted by and get worked up about. That kind of fades away when things get bleak like that. And so, there's a lot of nostalgic memories like that, even that aren't as dramatic as like going through a war where your city's being bombed, but that are just, difficult times for me that you felt like have created your character, have, cultivated who you are, that have made you grow personally, that have given you like an appreciation for life. So I think it's those meaningful, like these are like significant memories. Now, like, doesn't mean every nostalgic memory is like that. Some nostalgic memories are, hey, me and my buddies, went on a road trip. Like anything, there can be like there's like an intent, there's like a continuum of some memories are just kind of like lighthearted fun, and some are very, very deep. But when you ask people to share a nostalgic memory with you, they often kind of go to something that's really, really important, a cultural rite of passage, an important family event, something that really changed the course of their life. Or something like that.
Right. I suppose would your example of mowing the lawn when you were a kid with your dad would that be sort of maybe a less intense version of something where at the time it was not pleasant, but to go back to that memory?
Absolutely, yeah. So my dad used to make me go like mow lawns, and I hated it. Like I was just like, this isn't great. Yeah. And I remember always trying to wash that gasoline smell off of my hands. And it's just like, I just smelled like gasoline all the time. And it's weird because it was very aversive. And now if I get that, like even that little hint of like gasoline smell, like it triggers the nostalgia. Like, and smell is a powerful sensory input, like that kind of triggers nostalgia. Typically it's things we want to smell, like food.
Yes. Yeah.
But things that are attached to memories, and the reason I think that kind of stands out as a nostalgic memory is, again, I only came to that, I only started thinking of that as a nostalgic memory after my dad died. And I think what it was is I was like looking for experiences I had that like my dad taught me something. He was trying to teach me work, as a kid, a lot of teenagers don't work now, actually. But when I, starting from like 12 or 13, I had a paper route. My dad made me mow lawns. I mean, he was very much like, this is how you learn, like to grow up and be a man. Is like, you have to work and you have to be responsible and, save. And like, so he was trying to teach me all this stuff, like financial responsibility, work ethic. And so at the time I was like, this is, I don't like, it's summer, I'm out of school. I don't want being dragged out of bed early in the morning to go mow lawns. But then I look back on it and I was like, yeah, that was really good. That contributed to sort of my work ethic today. So I think that's where, that's that example of, yes, it was kind of a negative memory, but it was a valuable one. It helped me. And now I can kind of look back and revisit that memory with a new appreciation for, not as traumatic as, surviving a war or anything like that. But, these little life experiences that we think, even if they are unpleasant or difficult, that we think somehow helped us define our sense of self.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about, and after reading your book too, is the relationship between nostalgia and beauty, especially in relation to memory. So when I, the past year, I've been organizing a bunch of events, dinners, and other kinds of conversations, and often we start with a question like the one I posed to you, and people share their experiences of experiences of beauty from their past. And I wonder if would you say that all of those encounters with beauty from our past are nostalgic memories? Because there is an affective component to it. You're recalling something that was it varies on some spectrum of, being moderately pleasant to intensely sort of awe-provoking, but often connects to some experience of moral beauty, maybe a grandparent or someone who you recall fondly,
Mm-hmm.
some yearning for an experience of being protected, of peace, etc. Would all of those memories of beauty be nostalgic, or how would you see that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that makes sense. And another way of framing it might be nostalgia is about like what makes life beautiful, right? Like
Mm,
this, our nostalgic memories are part of what makes life beautiful. And so
mm,
we have a bunch of, as I noted, we have a bunch of mundane memories that are
yeah.
it's not like these are useless memories. Like it's good to know. It's good, for instance, that I know how to drive to the grocery store and like
Right, right.
what aisle things are on. It's like you don't want.
Yeah,
It's good to have habituate, right,
yeah,
and to be able to know, to have that kind of level of memory. But that's not what really enriches life and adds that layer of color to life. And I think so. Yeah, I think nostalgia memories are beautiful memories. I think that's a good way. That's a good way to say it.
yeah, yeah. One of the things I was struck by in your book, work. I mean, a couple of findings. One, I think you noted that 80% of people weekly seem to experience nostalgia. But also, I think you had noted that people turn to nostalgic memories when they experience negative challenges to their sense of self continuity. And I wonder if there's any relationship. I mean, do you feel that, or do you see in your research at all that there's any kind of increase? Are people becoming more nostalgic today? Are people struggling more with their sense of continuity? Is that like what is provoking this turn to nostalgia? Is it just a normal human operation that would sort of you would expect to find this distribution at all times and places, or is there something about our time today that is driving people a bit more in
Yeah,
this direction?
I think both are true. For one, it is a normal part of the human experience, and so you can think of nostalgia as actually having like two classes of triggers. And so a lot of triggers are like what we just call sensory input. So you hear that old song, you
Yeah.
see an advertisement. I mean, this is what a lot of marketing, like nostalgic marketing, is about. It's like directly triggering like nostalgic feelings. And so just because we live in a world like full of these types of experiences, especially now, people spend a lot of time online, and it's a lot easier to access nostalgic content and to promote nostalgic content. That the world does seem to be increasingly populated with nostalgic material, which has the input effect of maybe increasing nostalgia. But in
Mm,
addition to those kinds of triggers, there's also what we call internal psychological triggers. And those tend to be experiences of dissatisfaction or distress. So,
mm,
anxiety, loneliness, a lack of meaning, a sense of discontinuity, um, financial insecurity, anything that's going on in your life that's
mm,
like distressing to you tends to increase nostalgia. So to your question, it is true that in times of like broad scale distress, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance,
mm,
nostalgia at the society level increases. So, for instance, in Spotify during the pandemic, people were listening to more music in general, but they were especially listening to older music, to nostalgic music. So nostalgia does increase as a function of when society is going through difficult times. So not surprisingly, I do think we are in a time period where there's a great amount of nostalgia because there's so much um, political polarization. There's so much worry about artificial intelligence, social media, how the world is changing. It seems like the faster the world changes, the more we have that discontinuity, the more we feel disconnected, for unstable in some way from who we are and how we've tried to build our lives, which inspires us to like pull from the past and be like, no, okay, I can stabilize myself. I can find some sense of continuity. So I do think it's true that um, in times that are, perhaps more disruptive, you might say nostalgia increases. But because our personal life, but at the more granular level, everyone's personal lives are going at various points in time are going through different
yeah, yeah,
amounts of
yeah.
discontinuity. So in our research, we found, for instance, the more people are experiencing things like job loss, the loss of a loved one, a relationship separation or anything like that in their own lives, nostalgia increases, which helps explain why nostalgia sometimes fluctuates as a function of age. So there are periods, people go through different things at different times, of course, but in general, you could say there are periods in development, like the transition from childhood to adulthood, that are disruptive. You're going away to university, you're moving out of your family home, you're starting a job, like a vocation, you're doing something new where you're not just a kid in your parents' house anymore. Nostalgia tends to go up during that period because you're going through a new experience, and it's like you're pulling from the past as a way to stabilize yourself and to find like that confidence and motivation. Perhaps then you get things sort of figured out, you figure out your career, you partner up, you kind of move through this period of stability, and then nostalgia seems to settle down, and then it starts to go back up again, probably in your like 40s. And so it's like your kids are getting older, you're starting to think about like them, them going away, empty nesting, you're starting to go through midlife. Like if you're me, your vision's getting worse, you're losing your hair, like your life's changing again. And so this is another period of like disruption, and you're like, you're turning to the past for comfort. And of course, as you get older, you start to lose loved ones and so forth. Again, any of these things can happen at any point in your life, but we do see like a small but significant quadratic effect of lifetime nostalgia, where it goes up kind of in young adulthood, kind of settles a little, and then starts to go back up as you get older. That's important because if you just look at a simple correlation, you don't really see a lot. The effect of nostalgia and age is fairly small. And I think it's because it's not linear.
Right.
But again, there's a lot of variability within that, of course, because at any point in time, you can have life can throw you a big challenge and a big hurdle, which might trigger increased nostalgia for you personally. But when you scale out to like this, across the lifespan and across societies, you can kind of see these broader trends of nostalgia, going up or down as a function of, chaos, distress, uncertainty versus stability, and so forth.
Yeah. It seems like around the world, a lot of populist movements, and we're seeing, here in the US as well, with sort of Make America Great Again, but, in other countries as well, seem to be hearkening back to a kind of almost like a golden era where things were better. Do you think that the world is somehow getting maybe more? Is this a reflection of some kind of growing anxiety around the world? Not just in the US, but what's happening that's driving movements that seem to want to I guess provoke a sense of nostalgia, or that might be responding to a growing sense of nostalgia around the world? What's happening there?
Yeah. So to be clear, like sure, there's a lot of causes for these types of trends, and I'm not a political scientist. I'm sure there's all sorts of other things going on, but I do think that where the nostalgia component comes in, where the psychological component comes in, is yes, you're seeing a lot of societal change and disruption, and that's triggering this sense of like, who are we? Like, the desire to like solidify some sort of societal or national identity of some collective sense of self, and looking backwards. And this is, the tricky part about this type of nostalgia is it's not always healthy, and it can be manipulated in ways. So for instance, I'm not saying politicians are like reading our research on nostalgia, but notice how it seems like there's an implicit understanding of this relationship between this distress and nostalgia, because politicians don't come out and say, oh, look how awesome everything is right now, you should we should go back to the way things were. They try to provoke a sense of anxiety or fear, right? They tell you how the world's falling apart. And so they manipulate it in that way. Even if things are going relatively well, like generally the goal is to be like, no, things aren't going well. Vote for me. And then it's like they understand that, like, well, things aren't going well. How do we make them better? Well, we look to the past. And there is, I mean,
Mm.
there is some wisdom there. Like, I don't, I'm not dismissing that, but a lot of times it's done in a sort of prejudiced or unproductive way. And it's not just
Mm.
like the right wing populists. It's like you see this on the left too. You see,
Yeah.
like in the
Yeah.
environmentalist movement, you see kind of this glamorizing of like a past before industrialization, and of course that wasn't, there was mass
Mm.
starvation and disease and all sorts of problems. But you see this on both
Yeah.
sides. Like, it's not just a purely right wing thing. You see it in a lot of kind of left wing movements too. But again, the idea behind it, if instead of, the way I try to approach it is, instead of like just criticizing it, I try to understand, well, what are, maybe they're misguided, but there's something going on here. And I think they're identifying, challenges, and maybe some of these are exaggerated, but they're identifying real problems. Like, they're saying, oh, we are concerned about climate change. We are concerned about, like, growing like violence, or, we are concerned about these different challenges. We are concerned about, the potential for people to lose jobs to machines.
Yeah.
And again, these aren't always rational fears. A lot of times they are, or a lot of times it's a combination of, there's something there, but then, they exaggerate. But then I think what's useful is to then say, okay, they're looking for something. They're looking for some guidance. And as I noted before, it's not the case that people really want to go back to the past. What they want is certain elements from the past to influence how we design the future. We're moving forward no matter what. Like, we don't actually have time machines. We can't go back. Like,
Yeah.
we're moving
Yeah.
forward in time. That's the only
Yeah.
direction we can go. And so what we're saying is, the world I want tomorrow, maybe there's
Mm.
something I can borrow from this. And sometimes it's not always, like I said, sometimes it's not always healthy. But I think
Yeah.
even in contexts where we might not like historical nostalgia, it's better to recognize that this is a real thing, and then how can you help shape it in a more productive way. Like, I've done a lot of work at the Archbridge Institute and the Human Flourishing Lab on the concept of patriotism. Now, a lot of people, you talk about patriotism and they get a little bit weird. They're like, oh, that's some like far right thing. It's like, no, there's a lot of good evidence in social psychology that's actually really important for people to feel like they're part of a group that's larger than themselves. It promotes cooperation, it promotes collaboration, it helps people, sacrifice like kind of hedonic like goals to do something big, to participate in something bigger than themselves. It increases social trust. There's lots of good reasons to support like a healthy form of patriotism around a shared, some kind of shared national identity. And you can do that in a non-prejudicial way. You can do that in a very productive, healthy way that's not xenophobic, that's not prejudicial. So I think there are ways to recognize, no, people want to be, people want to feel like they're part of a country and they're proud of their country and they belong to something and they're working towards something. Not to mock or dismiss that, to be, no, that's important. But how do we avoid where this goes off the rails, or how do we avoid where this becomes prejudicial or harmful in some way? And so
Yeah.
I think that's like an important way of like addressing some of these concerns that people have about that, like, looking back, the past is better.
Yeah, yeah. It also seems like it's worth interrogating the kinds of things we're nostalgic about, right? And because I think it's hard to not smuggle it in. I mean, I'm even thinking of, Marx's writings they're very nostalgic in many ways, and so all these calls for revolution are embedded in some kind of nostalgia for a primitive state of nature that is a kind of fiction, right? And I think scrutinizing some of that can be really helpful to sort of think about, well, is this the kind of future that's realistic or possible or worth desiring? I'm curious though as to what you see as the potential for nostalgia to help us innovate. So is it a driver of innovation then?
I think so. When I was working on that book, I was talking to different artists, filmmakers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and basically all of them have a nostalgic story of what's made them passionate about what they're doing. So you can talk to a filmmaker and they'll talk about the movies that they saw as a kid, and that movie that really is like, I want to do this. And so at one basic level, I think nostalgia fuels that passion, that desire to do something. And so that in itself is important. But then if you look at the content on what they're doing, look at somebody who's trying to make like really cutting edge music, trying to do something really different. And, watch interviews with them and they'll talk about, well, I'm trying to do this, but I grew up listening to this and I wanted to give a nod to the, work in these kind of beats or do this kind of, so you'll see people mixing genres from the past, adding a modern element to it, sampling things, like coming up with a new version of it. You see this in fashion, right? A lot of fashion is about like using like new materials, but then doing like some kind of cut or something that's a nod to the past. So I think in the creative spaces where people are trying to do the freshest stuff are extremely nostalgic. If you look at car designs, they're trying to make them as state of the art as possible because people want new technology, they want fuel efficiency, they want electric vehicles, they want everything like hyper connected on there. But it's like there's some kind of aesthetic or something that they're a retro aesthetic or something that they like, or there's some kind of inspiration behind it. So I think nostalgia is definitely a big part of both the like motivational, like the passion kind of component of innovation, and also in terms of getting ideas. Like taking, some of the most innovative ideas are the ones where they've really figured out something that's been done before and then put a new spin on it, given it a new direction that no one else thought of taking it in. And so I think that's very much part of innovation.
Yeah. Great. That's really it for the questions I had for you, but I'm curious if you might have any tips or recommendations for our listeners about how to harness the positive powers of nostalgia and perhaps also anticipate some of its negative potential, right? Because it seems like it does have the power to both draw us away from others or draw us simply to the past, but also draw us into social connection and towards innovation, towards a healthier self-concept, and so on. So what might be ways in which people could leverage its potential?
Yeah. I think what I call intentional nostalgia is, we can all get benefits from just a very like passive nostalgia. You don't have to be like real deep about it. Like, people find it nice just to listen to old music. It pumps them up to, to go to the gym. But intentional nostalgia is what I describe as really trying to like revisit a memory. The more engaging you can make it, the better. So if you want to journal or do some type of creative activity that allows you to really like sit with the memory and reflect on it, and then ask yourself like, why is this memory nostalgic to me? Why do I feel this way about this memory? What challenges or issues am I going through today that this can help me with, and why? So I think that really like that deeper inspection, and then it can help you. It can also help prevent it going in a bad direction, because I think sometimes if you just do kind of a really like glossy version of nostalgic music, oh, things were so much better when before all of this. It's like, now if you sit there for a minute and you really dig into it, you'll be like, oh, okay, like this is why it wasn't necessarily all better. But then you can say, well, but what is it? Like, what was special about the time? And does that have any relevance for today? I think it's an especially helpful way to really get that more intentionality of it is to do it socially. I mean, to conversationally, to talk to people that you shared these memories with. It's great to sit around and talk about old memories. And then you can kind of push each other a little bit in ways to like really unearth like, something that you maybe didn't remember about that. And somebody else might say, actually, I guess you forgot about this part that wasn't so great. Or do you really, you wouldn't give up what you have now for that. So I think that kind of, that conversational nostalgia can be really helpful. But all that being said, I think most of the time, the way we interact with nostalgia isn't this sort of deep reflection, but we just like passively make contact with it. We've got that photograph on our desk of our favorite vacation, or even we like, as I brought it before, like we create that playlist on our Spotify that we like to have at the gym because it pumps us up or makes us feel youthful and young again. Those things are oftentimes treated as like they're kind of like pointless or they're just silly fun. I think those things are actually pretty useful for helping kind of energize us and inspire us. So it can be really, really good to do a deeper dive into nostalgia, but it's also perfectly fine and healthy and productive just to kind of populate your life with a little bit of nostalgia here and there. I don't know if you have noticed, but behind me, I have this arcade.
I was going to ask you about, definitely, yeah.
And it seems
say a bit more. So our listeners may not be able to
Okay.
They'd have to tune in to the YouTube video, but maybe you could just describe a little bit of what the arcade machine is behind you.
So I've got this old arcade machine in my office in the background that you can see on the camera if you watch the video. And it's a Robotron. It's a game. It's an old game. It's like probably no one's heard of it. But I have a friend who goes around and buys old arcades that are like banged up, not working anymore, and then he rehabilitates them. And I asked him, "Why do you do this?" And he said, "Because these are things that brought people a lot of joy, and they're dead. Like they're just been cast aside. And I want to bring them back. Like I want to, I think there's still more joy to be had." So I think that in itself is kind of a cool thing. And then he offered to do this for me. And like a good nostalgia, what it is it's got the old cabinet and the old art and everything, but it's actually a PC in there with a modern LCD screen. And there's hundreds of games on this. So I think that's a good example of like how to make nostalgia like more forward looking. It's just like, yeah, it's got the retro aesthetic and the controls, and and it's kind of fun. It reminds me of arcades from back in the 80s, but it's actually like got a modern PC in it. And I'm kind of surprised. Like in some ways, like my wife let me drag that into the house and put that in my office. But I wanted to have some art, in my home office. And I was like, well, why not have like a more interactive art, right? So I don't even really play the thing that much. I turn it on every day when I'm working. It's just in the background. It kind of cycles through different backgrounds of games. I kind of just see it, occasionally look at it. And it's just a nice little like aesthetic flair that I find, someone who does a lot of work in nostalgia, I find useful. And it's not because an arcade machine itself is personally meaningful, but it reminds me of, I used to walk down to the convenience store with my buddies and we'd put quarters in the arcade and we'd play and we'd hang out. So even nostalgic, it turns out in our research, we find even nostalgic objects, consumer products, things that people tend to think of as superficial or like materialistic, the reason we're so nostalgic for them isn't for them themselves. It's because they're symbolic reminders of who we spent that time with. So like sports memorabilia, things like that, they remind, they're cues for what's really about relationships, I think. So even the things that seem like they're the most consumeristic or materialistic often have a deeper story that involves who you engage that activity with.
Yeah. It seems like then, maybe this is my final question, is that there seems to be almost a redemptive quality to nostalgia and to nostalgic objects. Do you see nostalgia as a spiritual resource, perhaps?
Yes. And in fact, there's some, this isn't my research, but there's some research that people who are higher in spirituality are higher in dispositional nostalgia. So all of us are nostalgic at some level. As you noted before, people tend to be nostalgic multiple times a week, in fact. But that does, like a lot, just like everyone has a need to belong, but some people are way more social than others, nostalgia is like that. There is an individual difference component of nostalgia that we refer to as nostalgia proneness. There's a number of things that it's correlated with that makes sense in terms of sociality, because nostalgia is so social. But one of these is spirituality. So people who are more spiritual tend to be more nostalgic. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think nostalgia, because so much of it is about even the example provided of like an ongoing relationship with a deceased. Like there's so many things about cherished memories that are transcendent in some ways. That I think there's a very, very spiritual component to them, even for people who would maybe not describe it, that don't see themselves as very spiritual. Maybe they wouldn't describe it that way. I think it captures some of those same psychological functions. And in addition to that, if you think about nostalgia at a more collective level, a lot of the religious practices and traditions and rites of passage and rituals have this historical nostalgic component that gives us some sense of transcendent, like that I'm part of something that was here before me. I'm getting plugged into it. I'm learning about it. I'm carrying forward these traditions. They will continue when I'm gone. And there's something very powerful about self-continuity that's not just, I want some stable sense of self in my own life, but this broader collective continuity that I want to feel like I'm part of something that was here before me and that will be here after me. And so, yeah, I would definitely say that the spiritual dimension of nostalgia is very much there. And also, I would say very underappreciated, understudied, undervalued, minus like a few studies here and there, like I mentioned, looking at it as a disposition that's correlated with nostalgia.
Yeah, great. Clay, this has been super insightful. I've learned a lot. Anything else you want to add before we close?
No, I don't think so. I think we kind of hit the high points. You had great questions. And yeah, like I always tell people, like, it took me, I don't know, 15, I've been studying nostalgia for not quite 25 years, but close. We're approaching that. It probably took me 15 years before I fully realized that nostalgia is, I think, really a future-oriented experience. Yeah, it's about the past, it's about memories, but really it's about how we go forward in our life. And so that kind of flipped a switch in me. That's why I called the book Past Forward. That flipped a switch in my thinking from seeing nostalgia as like a defense mechanism or coping resource that's healthy for us, to seeing it as more than that, as no, like it's a source of inspiration, it's a source of guidance, it's a source of creative energy and motivation. And so when people tell you, oh, nostalgia is like getting stuck in the past or, looking backwards, it's like, no, nostalgia is about moving forward. And you want to do that. When you want to move forward, you don't want to just do it aimlessly, right? You don't want to just be random, right? You want to move forward with intention and with purpose. And nostalgia is a treasure chest of cherished memories that can help you do that.
Yeah, fantastic. The book is really great. I recommend it. And I loved your exercises too, which I think can guide people to some important self-reflection on nostalgic experiences in their lives. And so we'll put a link in the show notes. Anywhere else you want us to direct listeners and viewers to, so they can learn more about your work? So I recently I joined the Substack world. And so I have a weekly newsletter called Flourishing Friday. And so that you can find, and, I don't just talk about nostalgia, I talk about lots of things related to progress, the psychology of progress, existential psychology, and nostalgia and things like that. Otherwise, you can find all of this at my website is just clayrutledge.com. And my employer is Archbridge Institute, where I do a lot of my research. And, you can find that at humanflourishinglab.org. Great. All right. We'll throw a bunch of those links into the show notes. Thanks, Clay. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so much, Brandon. It's been a joy.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.